I am going to tell you about the woman who cured my brother. That is not a word I use lightly. He was not ill in any way a physician could name. He was not grieving, not broken, not deranged in any manner that could be committed to a diagnosis and treated. He was simply cold. Cold in the way that certain great houses are cold, magnificent, drafty, impossible to warm, and not especially interested in being otherwise. And I say this as the man who has loved him since we were boys, running the same corridors, sharing the same tutors, riding the same hills above Dunmore in the long summers before title and estate came down on him like armor. He never quite took off. I say it because it is true, and because he would say it himself now, with a kind of wry, self-aware disbelief, that such a thing could ever have been so, or could ever have changed. It changed because of a leaner vein. And it changed, I should tell you from the outset, because of our grandmother, Lady Honoria Dunmore, who at the age of 74 had lost precisely none of her cunning, and had gained, over the same years that had accumulated in everyone else as mere age, considerably more patience for wielding it. I was there for all of it. I saw every piece. And I have told this story only once before, to my own wife on the night we were married, when she asked me what I thought love actually looked like when it arrived in a man who had never expected it, and had never prepared himself to receive it. I told her, it looked like my brother in the doorway of the library at Dunmore Castle, on a February evening with the oil lamps burning low and the wind screaming off the moors, and the snow building against the lower windows, standing entirely still, staring at a woman who was reading aloud to our grandmother, and who had not yet noticed him standing there. It looked like a man who had been asleep for 36 years, waking up with the stunned and slightly wondering expression of someone who has only just understood that the room has been lit the whole time, and that the darkness was something he had been carrying in himself. But I am getting ahead of the story. Let me begin where it actually began, which was a drawing room in Edinburgh in the first week of November, and a conversation between my grandmother and my brother that I was only present for in part. I heard the end of it through a door that had not been fully latched, which is, as you will come to understand, more than enough when the two parties are Honoria Dunmore and her eldest grandson. My brother's name and his title is Alastair Dunmore, the Duke of Dunmore, 8th of that line, heir to something like 40,000 acres of Scottish moorland, 2 principal estates, a townhouse in Edinburgh, and a reputation for cold-blooded competence and absolute imperiousness that had preceded him into every room he had entered since the age of approximately 22. He was called, in the drawing rooms of the Edinburgh season and in the rather more careful corridors of London, the Iron Duke of the North, a sobriquet he had never once encouraged and had never troubled himself to deny. He was not cruel. I want to be precise about this because it matters. He was not the sort of man who enjoyed another person's humiliation, who manufactured suffering for sport, who deployed his power carelessly. He was rigorous, not vicious. He simply did not invest in warmth. He managed his estates with a scrupulous efficiency that his tenants respected and his stewards genuinely admired. He discharged his duties to his title with a completeness that left nothing to be criticized. He was, by any honest accounting, a remarkable man. He was also, by the November of which I speak, 36 years old, unmarried and entirely unmoved by every effort that anyone, including, over 7 years of careful and devoted effort, our grandmother, had made to change either of those facts. Our grandmother had been trying since he was 29. Not openly. Honoria Dunmore was far too sophisticated for open campaigns, and she had known my brother long enough to understand that anything openly attempted was immediately and politely refused. She worked obliquely, architecturally, the way a master gardener shapes a path. A house party here, a dinner there, a young woman placed at precisely the right distance from the fire so that the candlelight caught her to advantage. My brother moved through these arrangements the way he moved through everything else, noticing them with perfect clarity, acknowledging them with perfect courtesy, expressing his appreciation for the gathering or the dinner or the convivial company with words that were entirely correct, and remaining, in all the ways that actually mattered, unmoved. After 7 years of this, our grandmother changed her approach. I know this because she told me so, not in the manner of a confession exactly, but in that particular way of hers in which a confidence is issued as a fait accompli, the decision already made and the telling of it merely the form. We were walking the West Garden at Dunmore, 2 days before Alistair's annual autumn visit, with the last of the season's color going brown in the borders and the hills above the castle turning to that particular deep shade of November, and our grandmother said to me, without any preamble at all, "I have found the right one, Callum." I said with the caution earned by long experience, "Grandmother, you have said that before." "I have speculated before," she said, with the precise distinction she applied to everything. "This time I know." She folded her hands over the head of her walking stick and looked out across the garden toward the hills, and she was quiet for a moment in the way that she was quiet when she was not resting but thinking, which looked similar but was not. "The difference is that this time I am not trying to impress him. Every woman I have brought to his attention for 7 years has been accomplished, titled, charming, well-connected, all of the things that one brings to a man of his position when one wishes to make an impression. And he has noticed every one of them and been impressed by none, because he is not a man who needs to be impressed. He has impressed enough people himself for a lifetime. What he does not have, and what he has never once been offered, what no one in 7 years of trying has thought to offer him, is someone who is simply honest." I waited. With our grandmother, waiting was always the correct response. "There is a girl," she said at last, "a Miss Vane, Eleanor Vane. Her father was a solicitor in Aberdeen, a decent man of good character who died indebted through no especial fault of his own. A principal client defaulted, some poor judgment in the final years of a long illness that left him unable to manage things as he once had. He left her with nothing but his books, his principles, and a small aunt in Stirling who cannot afford to keep her indefinitely, and who wrote to me in August asking very politely whether I might have use for a companion." She paused. I wrote back to say I might. I looked at her for a moment. "You engaged a companion." "I engaged a companion," she said, with perfect placidity. "And you intend—" "I intend nothing," she said, which was a complete untruth, and we both knew it. "She arrives on Thursday. Your brother arrives on Saturday. What happens after that is entirely up to them." I said, "Alistair is going to see directly through this." Our grandmother looked at me with the smile she used when she considered a concern well meant but beside the point. "My dear boy," she said, "your brother has spent 36 years seeing through every woman I have ever placed in his path. He saw through the accomplished ones. He saw through the charming ones. He saw through the ones with excellent estates and the ones with excellent minds, and the ones I genuinely thought might hold his interest for more than a fortnight. I have decided to stop placing strategically positioned women in his path and try something different entirely." She turned and began to walk toward the house, which was her signal that the conversation had reached its conclusion. "I am placing an honest one instead. We will see what he makes of that." Eleanor Vane arrived on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of November, in a hired coach with one worn leather bag, and a second bag that was packed so heavily with books that the coachman had commented on it at the coaching inn, and she had, apparently, refused to redistribute the weight. I was in the entrance hall when she came in, not by any particular design. I had been passing through on my way to the stables, and so I had the advantage of a first impression unprepared for by either of us. She was not what I had expected, though I would struggle now to say what I had expected. She was slight, with dark brown hair pinned neatly under a traveling bonnet that had been carefully mended at the brim where the lining had frayed, and she wore a gray wool traveling dress that was clean and very well maintained, but clearly several seasons out of the current fashion. She was perhaps 24 or 25, with a face that was neither plain nor striking precisely, but that had a quality to it, a steadiness, a quality of alert attention that made you look a second time when you had not particularly intended to look at all. She was not, at the moment of entry, flustered by the size of the hall or the cold grandeur of the castle, or the fact of having arrived as a stranger. She was looking at the entrance hall with the calm, methodical interest of someone who is noticing what she has arrived into and cataloging it rather than being overwhelmed by it. She noticed me looking at her, and met my eyes without any of the flustering or dropped gaze that a young woman in her circumstances and position might have been forgiven for. She said directly and pleasantly, "Good afternoon. I'm looking for Lady Dunmore. I am Miss Vane, her new companion." I told her I was Callum Dunmore and I would take her through. She thanked me with a warmth that was entirely simple, not performed, not carefully graduated to its social context, and followed me down the corridor at my pace without comment or nervous chatter. I introduced her to our grandmother, who received her with the particular warmth she reserved for people she had already decided she liked, which was not a large category but was consistently correct, and I excused myself. I did pause, however, in the corridor outside the drawing-room door, which had not quite latched when I had pulled it to, and I heard my grandmother say, in a voice that carried a warm note of genuine satisfaction, "Miss Vane, I am so glad you are here. I believe you are exactly what this house requires." And Eleanor Vane said, quietly and without embellishment, "I shall do my best, my lady. I should like to be useful." Not impressive, not accomplished, not delightful company or a credit to her position, or any of the other things a young woman in her situation might have offered as her opening credential. Useful. I stood in the corridor for a moment, listening to the drawing-room door settle on its frame, and thought that our grandmother, who was not wrong about people, might this time have exceeded even herself. My brother arrived on Saturday in the early afternoon, riding in from Edinburgh in weather that had turned sleet gray and cutting. He was in a fine humor, which for Alastair meant he was not visibly displeased and responded to questions with more than a single sentence, and he greeted our grandmother with the brisk, genuine warmth that he reserved for very few people in the world, and which, in him, was therefore worth considerably more than another man's extravagance. He was offered tea, which he declined, and a change of clothes, which he accepted, and he came down to dinner that evening looking precisely as he always looked, composed, entirely self-contained, and about as likely to be surprised by anything as the hills outside were. He noticed Eleanor Vane at dinner. I watched him notice her, the slight, automatic pause, the quick assessment that he applied to anyone new in any room, the filing, and I watched him place her in the category of household staff and redirect his attention back to the conversation with the same fluid efficiency he brought to every other transition. She was seated at the far end of the table in her capacity as our grandmother's companion, attending to the grandmother's water glass and to the easy rhythm of a long-established dinner table, and she spoke when spoken to with a brevity and a precision that attracted no particular attention. It was the precision that made him look again. I saw the moment it happened. There was a break in the main table conversation, and our grandmother remarked on some discrepancy she thought she had noticed in the estate figures from the North Quarter. Alastair, who held every figure of every estate account in his head, began to respond, and Eleanor Vane said, from the far end of the table, without raising her voice or asserting herself in any way, simply filling the pause that had naturally opened, "The discrepancy runs across 3 years, I believe, 1849 through 1851. The undercounting in the winter quarter appears to be consistent rather than accidental, which suggests a recording practice rather than an error." The table went briefly quiet. My brother looked at her. Not harshly, he was never harsh without cause, but with the direct, assessing attention that most people found uncomfortable to receive, and that Eleanor Vane appeared not to find uncomfortable at all. She met his gaze without any of the flinching that gaze usually produced. He said, "You reviewed the tenancy accounts." "Lady Dunmore asked me to see whether anything looked irregular," she said. "I found something irregular. In the North Quarter. In 3 years' worth of North Quarter winter records." She paused. "I would not want to say more without the earlier ledgers. There may be context I am missing." He looked at our grandmother, who was examining her wine glass with the expression of a woman, attending to nothing in particular, and following this exchange with every fiber of her attention. He said nothing further on the subject at the table, but the meal was not yet done, and there was one more exchange that I have not yet described. It came near the end of dinner, when the conversation had moved on to other things, and the wine had made the table slightly easier, and our grandmother said, with the innocence of a woman who has never been innocent of anything in her life, that Miss Vane had been so kind as to complete the library inventory, and that the 4th case had yielded some remarkable finds. My brother said, with genuine interest, he loved the library as a man loves the thing he has been keeper of longest and knows best, that he had not been aware the 4th case had been opened in some years. Alina said that it had not been, by the look of it, in possibly a decade, and that there was a collection of correspondence in the back of the bottom shelf that had been misfiled among the theological volumes, and that appeared, from the hand and the dates, to predate the current arrangement of the castle entirely. My brother set down his fork. "What hand?" he said. "An old secretary hand," she said. "Mid-17th century, I would estimate, though I am not a specialist. The paper is very fine. Some of it concerns property arrangements in the northern holding that may predate the current title." She paused. "I left it where it was until I could be told whether it was of significance." He looked at her for a moment. "You read secretary hand?" Slowly, she said. "My father had an interest in legal history. He taught me the basics." Another small silence. "And you noted the date from the internal content," he said, "not the handwriting alone." "The paper is watermarked," she said. "The watermark style corresponds to a particular mill in Edinburgh that I happen to know closed in 1668, so the letters are earlier than that." My brother was quiet for the space of 3 full seconds, which was, for him, the equivalent of an exclamation of astonishment. Then he said to no one in particular, "I have owned that library for 17 years. He picked up his fork again. He said to Alina, "I should like to see those letters tomorrow morning if you are willing." "Of course," she said, and returned to her dinner. I watched him through the rest of dinner, and through the hour in the drawing-room that followed, and I counted 3 separate occasions on which his gaze returned to Alina Vane, not with any warmth, not with what could be called personal interest, but with the fixed, careful attention of a man who has encountered something that does not fit his existing filing system and is in the early stages of deciding what to do about it. He was too disciplined to show anything as unguarded as curiosity, but it was there. In him, curiosity of that kind was practically a declaration. The fortnight that followed was, from the outside, unremarkable. Alastair conducted his annual review of the Dunmore properties and accounts, rode out with the estate steward, sat with his correspondents in the evenings, read until late. He was, as always, perfectly correct in all his interactions and intimate with absolutely none of them. Alina Vane moved through her days with the same calm practicality she had arrived with. In the mornings she read to our grandmother from whatever they had currently in hand. She read well, with a natural sense of where the music lived in a sentence, neither overperforming the emotion nor flattening it. In the afternoons, she worked on the library catalogue, which had accumulated a decade of cheerful disorder, or she handled our grandmother's correspondence with a clarity and directness that prompted Lady Dunmore's Edinburgh solicitor to write back, on receiving one of the resulting letters, and ask whether Lady Dunmore had engaged a secretary, and whether the secretary might be available to assist with other matters. She did not perform. That was the quality I kept returning to, watching her. Every woman who had passed through Dunmore Castle in 7 years of our grandmother's careful campaigns had performed, to some degree, not dishonestly, but with the natural adjustment of manner that a social context requires, the subtle calibration of presentation when one is aware of being observed. Eleanor Vane simply did what was in front of her to do. If my brother was in the room, she was the same. If he was not, she was the same. I began to understand by the end of that first week that this was not strategy, not the sophisticated performance of unstudied ease that certain clever women achieved for exactly that effect. It was simply who she was. She was the same in every room, the same on Tuesday as on Saturday, the same whether she was alone with the catalogue or seated at the far end of a dinner table with the Duke of Dunmore looking at her from across the silver. I think this, more than any other single thing, was what began to undo him. The first thing I witnessed directly, the first moment that was not my observation of him observing her, but a moment between them in which something actually happened, was on a Tuesday morning in the library. I had gone in to retrieve a book I had left on one of the reading chairs the previous evening. The fire had been lit not long before, and the room was still cold from the night, the winter light coming thin and gray through the tall windows. Eleanor was at the far end of the room on the library steps, replacing a row of volumes on the upper shelf with the deliberate, unhurried efficiency she brought to everything. My brother was at the writing table near the north window with a letter open in front of him and a pen in his hand. He was not reading the letter. He was watching her. Not covertly. My brother considered covertness a form of dishonesty and therefore did not practice it, but with a direct, open attention that he perhaps did not realize was as legible as it was. She came down the steps with 3 volumes stacked in her arm and moved to the long table near his, consulting the catalog page in her other hand. "These 3 belong in the East case," she said, without looking up from the catalog. "But the East case is currently at capacity until the duplicates in the 3rd row are relocated to the secondary collection in the morning room. I have a list of proposed removals, if you would like to review it before I proceed." My brother said, "Why would I need to review it?" "Because it is your library," she said, with the pleasant simplicity of someone stating something obvious, "and several of the duplicate volumes are rather fine, and you may have a preference about which collection receives them." She set the catalog page on the table in front of him. "I have marked the ones I was uncertain about in pencil, so your decisions won't be permanent until you say so." He looked at the page. He picked up his pen and made 3 notations, unhurriedly in his own careful hand, and slid the page back across the table. "Proceed as you see fit on the others." She retrieved the page, scanned his 3 notations, gave a small nod, and stacked the volumes back into the crook of her arm. She was about to carry them toward the door when he said, and there was a fractional pause before the words, the very small pause of a man who has not quite decided to say something until the moment it is already being said, "You read Latin." She stopped, she turned to look at him. "A little, my father taught me." "The catalog entries for the theological volumes are in Latin, the original ones from the 4th case." "Yes," she said, with a quiet self-possession that did not press the point. "I noticed," and she went out with the books. I retrieved my own book from the chair and allowed myself a single glance at my brother. He was looking at the door she had gone out of with an expression I had not seen on his face before and could not immediately name with any precision. It was not desire, or not only that. It was closer, I thought, to the expression of a man who has just been given a map to a territory he did not know existed, and who is in the process of realizing that he has, in fact, been searching for it for quite some time. I left him to whatever it was and found our grandmother an hour later and told her what I had seen. She listened to all of it with her embroidery in her lap and her needle going steadily, and when I had finished she said, "Good," and returned to the embroidery. There was an evening near the end of the 3rd week when the gradual became something else. A storm had been building off the moors since mid-afternoon, the particular kind of storm that was native to Dunmore, that came fast and dark and changed the quality of the air before the first drop fell, so that you felt it arriving before you could prove it was there. By 5 o'clock the wind was up in earnest, and I had been moving through the upper corridors securing the windows that always rattled loose in weather like this, which was a long-established Dunmore occupation in November, when I heard a crash from below, a heavy, sharp sound, the kind produced by something falling that was not meant to fall, and then, after a moment, nothing, which was somehow worse than the crash had been. I came down the east stair to find the lamp stand in the east passage, lying on its side in the near darkness, the lamp glass broken across the flagstone floor, the draught from a window that had blown open before anyone could latch it, guttering what remained of the oil light. Eleanor was kneeling on the floor beside the lampstand, picking up the larger pieces of the broken chimney in the limited light from the window, and she had cut her hand not deeply, but enough, the blood dark in the gray light, and she had not stopped what she was doing. My brother was already there. I do not know when he had arrived or from which direction. The castle had several approaches to that corridor, and he was a man who moved quietly and without announcing himself. But he was crouching beside her on the flagstone floor with his coat still on, and his expression doing the particular thing it did when something had his full and undivided attention, which was to go absolutely still, everything else shut away, only the thing in front of him present to him. He had her hand in both of his, and was holding it up to what remained of the light from the window, examining the cut. She had not withdrawn her hand. She was looking at him, or looking at the side of his face, which was what was visible to her, with an expression I could not entirely make out in the low light, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "It is quite small. I am sorry about the lamp." "Don't apologize for the lamp," my brother said, and his voice was different, lower than its usual register, stripped of the precise formality that he maintained like a kind of instrument. "Move these fingers." She moved them. "Good." He held her hand for a moment longer than the assessment required. Then he straightened, drew out his own handkerchief, white linen, initialed in black, and without any particular comment wound it around her palm with a neatness that suggested either field experience with minor injuries or simply the inability to do anything carelessly, even a small and domestic thing like this. He tied it off with a precision that was unnecessary and characteristic. He said, "You should have Mrs. Reed look at it before you sleep." She said, "Yes, thank you." He picked up the broken lamp himself, not a task that the 8th Duke of Dunmore was in any way expected to perform, and carried it away down the passage without further comment. I had stepped back into the shadow of the stair alcove at some point during this, with the instinct that neither of them had known I was there, and that this should remain the case. I stood in the shadow for a moment after he had gone, thinking about his hands on her hand, and about the white handkerchief wound around her palm with its completely unnecessary precision, and about his voice going lower and different. Then I went to find our grandmother, and I told her about the handkerchief. She looked up from her writing table with a brightness in her expression that was very nearly triumph. "Good," she said, for the second time, and returned to her letter. "I want to be honest with you about Eleanor Vane, because it would be easy and dishonest to make her a saint in the telling. She was not. She was practical to a degree that could occasionally border on the blunt. She had opinions about the catalog, about the estate records, about the curtains in the morning room, which she pronounced quietly and without aggression, but pronounced nonetheless. She was not deferential in the way that her position might have suggested. She was respectful. She did not argue without cause, did not forget where she was or who she was speaking to, but she answered questions honestly, including questions to which the honest answer was not the most comfortable one. She laughed. Not often, and not loudly. She was not a woman who produced laughter for social effect. But when something genuinely struck her, She laughed with a fullness that was a little startling coming from such a composed face. It happened once, at dinner, when my brother made a remark about the Edinburgh legal fraternity that was so precisely observed and so completely unexpected that the whole table laughed, and Eleanor laughed, and my brother, who registered the effects of his own remarks only intermittently, looked at her with the expression of a man who has heard a sound and wants to hear it again. He looked at her for approximately 2 seconds, and then he looked away, and if anyone else at the table noticed, they were too well-bred to say so. Our grandmother noticed. Her fork paused, almost imperceptibly, above her plate before she resumed. The laugh was, I believe, the second thing that moved him. The first had been the Latin. The third was harder to pin to a single moment. It accumulated over days, in the incidental, practical interactions of a large household in deep autumn, in the specific way that something consistent and genuine will wear down even the most carefully maintained distance. My brother had always carried the management of Dunmore as a solitary discipline. He knew every detail of every account and every holding, held every thread of it, trusted no one else to hold any part of it, which was both a remarkable quality and, over the course of 36 years, an exhausting one. He had never, in my observation, allowed anyone to share any of the weight of it. He began to consult Eleanor Vane about the estate records. Not formally, not as a decision he announced or even as something he seemed to make a deliberate choice about. It happened the way a river finds its way around an obstruction, naturally, quietly, without being directed. A question asked in the corridor where she happened to be passing with the catalogue. A ledger placed on the library table with an implicit invitation to comment. Once this was the moment I marked, a correction, offered by her gently and directly, to a figure he had misread in the North Quarter accounts for the winter of 1848, accepted without any stiffening of pride, any qualified acknowledgement, any of the several forms of graceful ego management that a man of his position might have been expected to deploy. He simply said, "You are right, thank you," and adjusted the figure. She did not make anything of it. She verified the correction, supplied its source, and returned to what she had been doing. She did not press the opening. She did not withdraw when he was cold. He was still, occasionally, cold, because old habits are the last things to change, and a man cannot change 36 years in a fortnight. But when he was cold, she did not flinch and she did not capitulate. She simply continued to be exactly herself, which was the same in cold as in warmth, consistent and unhurrying and entirely present. I said to our grandmother in the 4th week, "He is bringing her the estate ledgers himself." She set down her embroidery needle with the deliberate care of someone managing a significant feeling. "I know," she said. "Did you plan for that as well?" She looked at me over her reading spectacles. "I planned an introduction," she said. "Your brother's decision to share the ledgers is entirely his own. He simply does not know it yet." She picked up the needle again. "He will in time. He is not a stupid man." Lord Ashcroft arrived in the 1st week of December, on a Tuesday, ostensibly to discuss the matter of a shared boundary on the Borders estate. He was wealthy and well-connected and handsome in a heavy, overconfident way, and he had possessed, even in his university years when I had known him slightly, the specific quality of a man who is charming precisely to the people who can benefit him and contemptuous of everyone who cannot. The boundary question took 40 minutes. Ashcroft then contrived to remain for 3 days. On the first evening he saw Eleanor Vane, and I watched him see her, the quick look, the second look, the recalibration of interest that had nothing respectful in it and something quite other. He asked our grandmother who she was, asked it across the drawing room in a voice that made it clear he expected the answer to be freely available to the room. Our grandmother said, in a tone of mild and entirely composed pleasantness, "Miss Vane is my companion. She has been invaluable to me these past weeks." Ashcroft smiled. "I can see why," he said, and there was something in the phrasing that was not a compliment, in the way that a look that lingers a moment too long is not admiration. My brother at the far end of the room had heard it. I know because his hand, resting on the arm of his chair, closed briefly, the fingers pressing the upholstery flat, and then releasing, before he redirected his attention to the fire. He said nothing. Over the 2 days that followed, Ashcroft was attentive to Alina in a way that was both persistent and deeply unpleasant to observe. He manufactured reasons to be near her. He asked her questions he had no interest in the answers to. He complimented her in the hollow, slightly elevated way of a man who is performing interest rather than feeling it, in the manner that certain men adopt toward women whose actual personhood they have not engaged with and do not particularly intend to. Alina was polite to him, scrupulously, immovably polite, and I watched her face when he spoke to her, and I saw, in the careful stillness she maintained, a wariness that she was too disciplined and too well-bred to express aloud. On the second evening, he made her an offer. Not a proposal of marriage. Something more practically insulting. He required a housekeeper for his estate at Galston, he said, and he had observed that she was clearly capable, and the position would pay well and provide. Here the pause was precisely, clumsily calibrated, certain additional advantages to a young woman with limited alternatives. Alina told our grandmother that same evening, in the morning room, directly and without drama. I was in the adjacent sitting room, the connecting door again not fully closed, which has led me to conclude that the architecture of Dunmore Castle was specifically engineered for the inadvertent overhearing of things. Alina's voice was entirely steady. She said she had declined. She said she wished to remain in Lady Dunmore's service, and she hoped that was acceptable. Our grandmother's voice, when she replied, had gone quite quiet and very cool, the particular coolness she used when she was most completely in command of herself and most completely in earnest. She said it was entirely acceptable. She said Lord Ashcroft would be leaving the following morning. Alina said, "Please do not make trouble on my account." "Miss Vane," our grandmother said, quietly and without any room for negotiation in it, "you are in my house and you are in my care, and you have been treated with a contempt that I will not allow to stand. There will be trouble on your account. That is not a matter for discussion." There was a silence. And then Alina said, "Thank you," in the voice of someone who is not entirely accustomed to being defended, who has learned to manage things alone and is not entirely sure how to receive the fact of protection without awkwardness. I heard our grandmother go out. I stayed where I was. Through the connecting door, in the silence that followed, I heard nothing for a long moment, nothing performed, nothing demonstrative, and then a very quiet sound that might have been Alina pressing her hands briefly over her face and breathing out once, before composing herself and returning to whatever she had been reading. I found our grandmother in the corridor. She looked at me with the particular expression of someone who has just had something confirmed that they had already known but had still been glad to have confirmed. "Your brother," she said quietly, "will be told tonight." She told him. I was not present for that conversation, but I saw my brother at the breakfast table the next morning, and his face told me everything. He was not angry in the visible way, he rarely was. It was not in his nature to be visibly anything without considerable cause. But there was a quality to his stillness that was different from his ordinary stillness, the way a river is different when the current beneath it is running fast and cold even as the surface goes smooth. He was courteous to everyone at the table. He ate almost nothing, and when Lord Ashcroft came down at 9:30 with the comfortable assurance of a man who expects the morning to go according to his own preferences, my brother looked at him across the breakfast table with the expression that had earned him his particular name in 3 counties, and said, in a voice that was entirely level, entirely measured, and entirely without inflection, "I believe your carriage will be ready within the hour, Ashcroft. I have arranged it." Ashcroft looked at him. He took a breath that suggested he was considering whether a protest was available to him. He looked at my brother's face, which gave him his answer on that question. "I had intended," he began. "Within the hour," my brother said again in the same tone. The breakfast room was very quiet. Ashcroft left within the hour. My brother spent the morning in the estate office, which was the place he went when he was managing something internally that he was not yet ready to examine in the open. I left him to it. In the afternoon he rode out on the moors alone, which was the second thing he did when something was working in him below the surface. He came back in the early evening with the controlled, deliberate calm of a man who has arrived at something. He went directly to the library. Eleanor was there with our grandmother. The fire was burning well. The storm had returned from the previous week in a softer form, the wind steady at the windows but nothing violent, and Eleanor was reading aloud from a novel they had reached the middle of, her voice quiet and easy in the room, carrying the story forward in the particular way she had with feeling, but without excess. Our grandmother was in her chair by the fire with her eyes closed, which, as I have noted, could mean she was asleep or could mean she was listening with great attention. With Honoria Dunmore, it was impossible to be certain. I was in the gallery above the library. I had gone up to return a volume to the upper shelves, and I had stayed, because the moment my brother appeared in the library doorway below me, something in the quality of the air in the room changed in a way that made staying feel like the right thing to do. He stood in the doorway and he looked at her. She had not heard him. The wind was at the windows and the fire was shifting and her voice was going steadily on with the prose, and so he had the entirety of that moment unobserved. The lamplight on her brown hair, the concentration of her face over the page, the composure that was not rigidity but was its own kind of strength, the voice carrying the words into the room as though she were simply here, present and sufficient and entirely herself, and as though that were entirely enough. I thought again of what I had said to my wife on our wedding night, when she had asked me what love looked like when it arrived in a man who had never expected it. I had been right. I was certain I had been right. He moved into the room. She heard him then, looked up from the page, turned, and their eyes met across the length of the library with a silence that had weight in it. Not the silence of two people who have nothing to say, but the silence of two people who understand that what they have to say to each other is significant, and that this is the moment, and that the moment should be handled carefully. Our grandmother did not stir. My brother said, "I owe you an apology." Eleanor said carefully, "You have nothing to apologize for." "I had a guest in my house who behaved without honor toward you," he said. "In my house. That is not nothing, whatever you may prefer to call it." She was quiet for a moment, considering him. Then she said, "He is gone." "He is gone," my brother agreed. He moved to the fire and stood with his back to it, which was his habitual position in any room, the Duke's position, the position of a man who is accustomed to keeping his back to the wall, not from fear but from the lifelong habit of facing outward. He looked at her, and something in his face had shifted, not disappeared, not transformed, but shifted in the way that a window shifts when it moves from latch to the first degree of open. He said, "You are not what I expected." When my grandmother engaged a companion, I assumed. He stopped himself. She waited with the patience of someone who is accustomed to waiting for things that are worth waiting for. He began again. "I assumed it was another scheme." She looked at him, "And is it not?" A beat, then almost he smiled. The suggestion of it at the corner of his mouth, the thing that might one day become a full smile given sufficient encouragement and time. "It may well be," he said. "My grandmother is not without her methods." He looked at the fire for a moment briefly and then back at her. "I find on this occasion that I don't object to the method." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she opened her book again, found her page, and turned back to our grandmother's chair. "I should finish the chapter," she said, with a composure that I thought cost her something, though she showed nothing of what it cost. "Lady Dunmore will want to know how it ends." Our grandmother in her chair did not move. My brother sat down in the chair across from her. He picked up the book he had left on the table the previous evening, and he opened it, and Alina read aloud, and the fire burned lower, and the wind went on at the windows, and I stood in the gallery above them for a long time before I went quietly away. December settled over Dunmore the way it always did. The light going early, the fires built high against the darkness, the snow beginning to cover the upper hills and then the lower ones, the world contracting to the warmth of the house and the small, close rhythms of the season. My brother stayed on past his intended departure date. He wrote to Edinburgh and rearranged the meetings that had been scheduled for late November, with explanations that he did not share with me, but that were, I think, entirely to do with the estate accounts and not at all to do with Alina Vane, or not only. He began to speak to her, not about the accounts, about other things. It started with books, as so many things at Dunmore did. A question about something she had been reading and her answer, considered and honest, and then something he had read and her engagement with it, and the conversation growing from there in the natural, unhurried way of two people who have more to say to each other than they have yet said. The 17th century correspondence in the fourth case became a project they took up together in the mornings, across the long library table with the winter light coming slanted and pale through the tall windows. My brother knew his family's history in the way that men of old title know it, thoroughly, structurally, with a kind of duty-bound familiarity. But Alina brought to it the fresh eye of a woman trained to read documents for what they actually said rather than what they were expected to say. She found things he had missed. She found, buried in the third packet of letters, a deed arrangement that resolved a question about the original boundary of the northern holding that had been a subject of quiet legal uncertainty for decades, and she set it in front of him one morning with the careful understatement of a woman who does not wish to make a spectacle of the right answer, but cannot in conscience leave it unsaid. He read it again. He set it down and was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "This settles it entirely." "I believe so," she said. "This has been uncertain for 40 years. It was in the bottom of the fourth case," she said, which was not a reproach and not a joke but was, somehow, both. He looked at her across the library table, and something shifted in his face, not dramatically, not in any way that would have been visible to a stranger, but it was there, and I saw it from across the room where I was pretending to read by the fire. A quality of warmth, nascent and careful, like the first real warmth of early spring in a season that has been very long. He told her, one evening in the library after our grandmother had retired, something about his father, just a few sentences, about how the seventh Duke had managed the northern tenants and what his method had been, and what in it had failed. This was not something I had ever heard him say to anyone outside the family, and I was the only family he had said it to, and even with me only once, years ago. Alina listened with her full attention, not the performed attention of a woman trying to appear interested, but the real attention of a woman who is genuinely interested, whose whole quality of presence shifts when something matters, and she asked one question, the right question, the one that went directly to the thing he had actually been saying beneath the thing he had said. He answered it. The conversation went on for an hour. When it ended, he looked in the firelight like a man who has set something down that he had been carrying for a long time without quite being aware of the weight. I think that is what mattered most in the end, not being charmed, not being managed. Being truly listened to, by someone who was entirely present and who, having listened, said something honest in return. Christmas Eve at Dunmore was what it had always been. The great hall assembled, the household gathered, family and staff, and the estate workers who lived on the grounds, the punch warm and the fire built to an abundance that the hall could barely contain, the evening having that quality it always had of being simply and entirely itself. Lord Fenwick was present, as he was every Christmas Eve, a neighbor, a decent widower of middle years, a kind and solvent man with no particular faults and no particular fire. He arrived with the cautious, hopeful attention of a man who has decided he might say something and has not yet decided when. He stood near the door with his punch glass, and he looked at a leaner vein with the quiet intentness of someone who is gathering his courage for a particular purpose. My brother saw him looking. I watched it happen. I watched the moment that my brother registered Lord Fenwick's gaze on a leaner, and I watched the thing that crossed his face, the briefest passage of something that was not anger and not fear, and was, I think, very close to the realization that something he had allowed himself, quietly and without announcement, to think of as already his might in fact be available to someone who moved faster. He was a man who was accustomed to making decisions of great consequence without visible emotion, and executing them without hesitation, and he had spent 7 years failing to make this one. He set down his punch glass. He moved through the assembled household with the quiet, purposeful directness of a man who has reached the end of deliberation and has begun to act. He crossed the great hall to where a leaner was standing beside our grandmother, in the deep green dress that I still suspect our grandmother had some hand in, and he stood before her, and the room around him went gradually, instinctively still, the way a room goes still when it understands that something is about to happen. He said, "Miss Vane, I should like to speak with you if you are willing." She looked up at him. The firelight, the assembled household, the room that had gone quiet. She said, "I am willing." He said, and every person in the great hall heard it, and no one there ever forgot it, he said, "I am not a man who speaks plainly about things that matter to me. I have been told this all my life, and I have always considered it a fair enough assessment. But I find on this particular occasion that speaking plainly is the only adequate choice I have left." He paused for only a moment, not from uncertainty but from care. "You came to this house as a stranger, and you have been without effort, without performance, without the smallest intention, so far as I could observe, of making me notice you, the most honest presence I have ever encountered in it. And I have encountered it for 36 years. He stopped again. "I should like very much for you to remain in it, not as my grandmother's companion, as mine." The great hall was entirely, completely still. Alina Vane looked at him for a long moment, the steady, unhurrying, genuinely attentive regard that was simply who she was, and then she said, "You are speaking plainly." "I am trying to." "Then I will also speak plainly." She lifted her chin slightly, not from defiance but from the dignity of a woman who has decided that honesty deserves to be met with honesty. "I am a solicitor's daughter with no money and no title and no connections that would serve you in any practical way. Your grandmother has been very kind to me. I have not, I want to be honest with you, been unaware of you, but I have not presumed." "I am not asking you to presume," he said. "I am asking you to say yes." She looked at him, he looked at her. The fire crackled. Someone's punch glass clinked very softly against the side of someone else's. Alina said, "Then yes." He did not sweep her up. He did not make a declaration to the room or draw her forward for the approval of the assembled household. He took her hand, the left hand, the one with the faint pale line of the heel cut across the palm, the hand he had wrapped in his own linen handkerchief on a dark evening in November, and he held it, and he looked at her, and something in his face that had been closed for a very long time opened quietly, without drama, the way a room opens when someone lifts the curtain and lets in the light. The great hall around them began to breathe again. The conversation resumed in twos and threes. The punch was passed. The fire was attended to. Lord Fenwick, near the door, looked into his punch glass for a moment with the expression of a man accepting a particular outcome with grace. Then he raised his glass very slightly, in a private toast that no one observed except me, and drank, and turned to speak to the estate steward. Our grandmother was still standing where Alina had been standing when my brother had crossed the room to her, and she turned to look at me with the expression of a woman who has moved correctly in a very long game, and is at this moment feeling everything she is owed on the investment. She said quietly so that only I could hear, "There you see." I said, "You are a dangerous woman." "I have always thought so," she said, with a warmth that made it entirely, unmistakably a compliment to herself. And then she looked back at her grandson, and the woman he was holding by the hand in the firelight of the great hall at Dunmore, and her expression changed into something simpler and older, and more purely glad than anything I had ever seen on her remarkable face. "Now they can begin," she said. They were married in February in the snow, at the church at Dunmore Village, with the hills white above them and the congregation's breath rising in small clouds in the cold air of the nave. It was a small wedding by any ducal standard. My brother had no patience for the occasion-making of society weddings, and Alina had no one to bring for spectacle, and they were therefore in complete agreement, for perhaps the first time on a practical matter, that the thing should be done cleanly and warmly, and with only the people who actually mattered. Our grandmother sat in the front pew and wept. This was the only time in my life before or since that I have seen her weep, and she has never once acknowledged it, and I have never once mentioned it, and this is the first time I have told anyone. I have known Alina Dunmore. She is still faintly, privately astonished by the name, which I find one of the most endearing things about her, for 6 years now. She manages Dunmore with a competence and a steadiness that have prompted the estate solicitors on more than one occasion to write letters of admiration to my brother that he receives with a pride that is, for him, extravagantly visible. She reads to our grandmother still, when Honoria permits it, which is most afternoons. She has made the morning room a place that is actually warm, and the library a system that actually functions, and the dinner table a place where conversation flows more easily than it did in the years before she came. She has made my brother a man who laughs. I know he would not say she changed him. He has said so when I have pressed, that she did not change him, that he is the same man he has always been, merely here he pauses, and the pause is precisely the length of a man acknowledging something he is not entirely comfortable acknowledging in better circumstances. That is the answer he gives, and it is not entirely wrong, and it is also not entirely complete. Because I was there. I was in the gallery of the library on a February evening with the lamps burning low, and I saw him standing in the doorway watching her read, and I know what that looked like. It looked like a man who had been carrying the cold, so long he had ceased to know he was carrying it. It looked like a man who had just understood that warmth was possible, not because someone had performed warmth at him, or shown him an impressive facsimile of it, or offered him warmth as a credential, but because someone had simply been genuinely, consistently, unperformingly herself, for long enough in the same rooms, and the truth of her had found its way through. She cured him of his cold, not by trying, by simply being who she was. Our grandmother, who arranged the introduction and called it nothing, who engineered the whole of it and describes it as a simple kindness to a young woman in reduced circumstances, was right about all of it. Not an accomplished woman, not a charming one, not a strategically positioned one. An honest one. And the Iron Duke of the North, who had held every acre and every account and every thread of 40,000 acres alone, who had sat through 7 years of careful introductions, and remained unmoved by all of them, who had been called cold by every county that knew him and had not disputed it, gave her his hand in the firelight of the great hall on Christmas Eve and held it, and did not let go. I have not in 6 years seen him let go.